Starting a podcast can be extremely nerve-wracking. You can second guess yourself, second guess the message you're trying to share, second guess if you are doing all the steps correctly. Well, this week we are going to be talking to Amy Climer. Amy just recently launched a podcast in June or so, and now we're going to take a quick look back at her process and what it was like for her to actually launch this podcast, to produce this content out in the world. And I think it's really special because her podcast is all around creativity. So we're going to talk a lot about the imposter syndrome, talk about what it takes to actually put your thoughts, your words out into the world, and how you can get over some of those hangups that you have about sharing your message. Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the podcast.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited that you're here, especially this is the inaugural in-person interview here in the new studio.
It's pretty sweet, it's awesome.
I'm super excited about that. But what we want to talk about today is actually your business and your podcast you just launched not too long ago, the Deliberate Creative Podcast. So I'm super excited to talk to you just about the whole launching experience, what it's like to dive into the whole podcasting world. Right. So before we really get in there, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about your business and how maybe even podcasting kind of fits into that business.
Okay. So my business is called Climer Consulting, and I work with teams and organizations to help them be more innovative, more creative, more effective. And mostly that is through in-person trainings. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's custom training, sometimes that's like general workshops where people from different organizations are all together. I started in 2009, so it's I feel like I've kind of got a nice flow now. Mm-hmm. I've got some awesome, really fun clients. I love it. And podcasting started. I feel like I'm actually kind of new to the podcasting world because I only first listened to a podcast maybe a little over a year ago. And I actually was initially inspired by Pat Flynn of Smart Passive Income. In fact, you might have even recommended that podcast to me. Someone recommended to it. I don't know who it was.
It's one of the best places you can start, I think.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So I listened to his very first episode, and he said that he was really nervous about starting a podcast, but he wanted to try it out and do it anyway. And I thought, that's actually a really good reason to start a podcast because I just think, that's what creativity is about. It's about taking risks and putting yourself out there and seeing what happens and knowing, hey, it might totally flop, but, learn something from it and try something different next time. So then I just started listening to different podcasts and just like in the back of my head thinking like, maybe I'll do this someday. And then you and I talked.
Yeah.
So this is now, I don't know, so this was all last year, 2014. Summer, fall.
Yeah, I think maybe right around November, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think we had like our first coaching session in December.
Yes.
And so then I launched the Deliberate Creative this June, so it took a while.
So you just started coaching in November and launched your podcast in June, you said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you and I started, I want to say our first session might have been like December 1st, or that first week was. And I thought, once I got the lay of the land, I'm like, this will be like, 6-8 weeks. I'll have this done by January. Yeah, no. It was much slower than I expected. And I think mostly because, there's just stuff going on, right?
Right.
Life, business, all that. And then there were just so many little decisions that, for me, slowed me down. Like, what's the name of the podcast? What's the angle going to be? And I feel like in the end, when I finally launched in June, in retrospect, I realized, I needed that time. I needed that time just to incubate in my head and to think through, like, what am I really doing? And I felt like I'm really glad I took that because I think if I launched in January, it would have been kind of a mess. So,
no, that's an excellent point. Just so, what do you think was it that really kind of held everything up? Was it just all those little decisions that you needed to be made, just kind of almost overwhelmed from that?
Yeah, I think it was, some of it was just coming up with a name for the podcast. And I mean, in general, I hate naming things. Like, I would be happy if someone else just named all my workshops, whatever. So I think some of it was that. And I actually went to my mastermind group at one point. I'm like, all right, y'all, I need 20 minutes. We have to figure out a name. And that's actually where the name came from,
nice.
Was in that little brainstorming session, someone brought up the deliberate creative, or maybe it was a combination. I don't even remember. And even then, I wasn't 100% sure. I kind of sat on it, and there were a couple other names I was considering. And then I was like, yeah, okay, I'm liking this. So I don't know that it was, one particular decision or one particular thing, but it was just that, everything takes longer than you think.
Yeah, that's an excellent
it's
point.
kind of anything.
Yeah, well, and I'm definitely helping a lot of people launch their podcasts. I've kind of realized that some people are ready to go right away. They have a plan, they kind of know what the structure needs to be, and they're just more or less like, okay, you take care of it, and I'll get you the interviews. But then others who want to be maybe more involved or don't completely have that exact idea of what the podcast needs to say, or like what the foundation of it is, yeah, it can definitely take a lot longer. That's kind of funny. So how does podcasting right now actually play a role in your business? Like, where does it fit? Is it just there for lead generation, for getting new clients? Where does it kind of fit?
I think there's a few different things. One is kind of just a personal passion, and that I'm really passionate about creativity. And there are so many myths out there about it. And I feel like, what would the world be like if we all really were living up to our full creative potential? And so I'm like, okay, well, this is a great avenue just to have those conversations and to get that research out there. Because I'm also a PhD student, and that's what I'm studying. And yeah, there's just all this research that no one knows about. And if we knew about it, we could use, So that's just kind of like a bit of my personal mission. I think as far as my business goes, definitely some lead generation, a little bit of, a way for people to get to know me, because I kind of feel like, anyone can make a nice website, but just a little bit of a way to get my personality out there and to, see if people feel like that's a good fit for them, for their organization. So, yeah.
Yeah, just kind of a way to get your voice out there.
Exactly.
Basically. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And yeah, podcasting obviously is a great avenue for that. So now that, you started your podcast, what was kind of let's back up. What was kind of your approach to launching your podcast? How did you go about it? How did things turn out? Were you happy? Was it kind of what you expected? A little bit different? What were some of the things in the launch process?
Let me think. Okay, so I started out, the actual date where I, announced on social media and everything was June 4th.
Okay.
So a few days before, maybe a week before, the last part of May, that's when I actually launched it, and I put 3 episodes up. And then I just sent an email to a bunch of friends and family, maybe about 50 people, and said, hey, I just launched this podcast. I really want you to go listen to it and write me a review. And so then by the time, June 4th came to actually launch, I had, maybe 3 or 4 reviews up. So that it just felt like a little bit more legitimate, Yeah. The first one was my brother.
Nice.
I was like, yep,
brother
love you.
coming in. Yeah, awesome.
And then even the first few days, I got quite a few more reviews. So maybe I had 10 reviews within a week or so. So that was really good. What else was in the question there?
No, I think that's awesome. I was just kind of wondering what your because you actually had some really great results in terms of iTunes rankings when you launched your podcast. Were high in several categories, if I remember correctly. So I was just kind of wondering, what did the launch look like? Was it just kind of asking a few close people to go leave a review and then just announcing it on social media? Yeah,
well, and I also have a pretty good mailing list for my business. At the time, it was probably about 1,000, 1,100 people. So definitely announced it there. In fact, I sort of did a pre-announce with followed Jeff Walker's launch.
Yep.
You gave me that book, and I don't even think I said, maybe I can't remember what the email was, but it was just this really basic email that said, hey, I'm launching this podcast. What are the top 2 things you want to know about innovation in teams? And I got a huge response, at least for me. I mean, it was probably 150 people, and which gave me a ton of ideas. It's like, I'll never run out of ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, some of them, like, I don't know how in the world I can answer that question on a podcast. This is just so complicated. But a lot of them say, hey, I'm excited about this, And so that, I think, just built a little anticipation, Then yeah, definitely a lot of social media. Send a couple more emails out that first month to my mailing list. I think, put an article on LinkedIn about creativity and reference back to the podcast. So, different things like that. Yeah, I feel like I was talking about it a lot the first 6 weeks. To the point where people were like, okay, yeah, Amy, we get it. Let go. But.
I mean, that's kind of the way it has to be a little bit, because, and in general, people, because it's the kind of thing where we hear ourselves talking about it all the time, we know about it, but I think for the most part, other people don't always see all those posts, don't see, like, everyone's not seeing everything you're putting out there, talking about it, so it's probably not nearly as big of a deal as we always think it is. I have that same problem too. So now you're on what, episode like 12, 13?
14.
14, okay. So you survived the launch, you got your podcast out there. Now what does your process kind of look like currently?
As far as like how I'm doing it each week?
Yeah, just how you're going about creating the podcast, getting it up there.
So I'm, I think probably ideal, and at least this is what I've heard from you and other people, is that, probably batch processing the content, just record all the episodes in one day. And for whatever reason, I'm not there yet. I'm still doing 1 or 2 episodes a week. I think I've gotten much quicker. So it used to take me like 5 or 6 hours per episode. And now I'm, with everything all together. And now I'm down to, maybe 3 hours, depending on what hang-ups come along.
Yeah.
I've started doing some interviews. So I think it was episode 8 was the first interview, and then I had a couple more of just me, and now I'm doing a few more interviews. Interviewing someone from Wikipedia later this week, which I'm excited about. Yeah.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, I think the director of learning and development is her title.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's sweet.
Yeah, so, but yeah, as far as my process, I usually have one day a week, usually Monday or Tuesday, where I kind of set aside either half day or full day, just like, this is going to be podcast time. And sometimes I'll do 2, sometimes I'm just doing 1.
Okay.
So,
So what have you seen as the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? Now that you're kind of in it, you got things moving, got things going, what's the big challenge of keeping it going?
I think just, staying diligent is definitely a challenge. Although, I mean, in some ways I'm really having fun with it, so that kind of helps with that diligence. It's like, oh yeah, I'm happy to put this as a priority because I'm enjoying it. And, the feedback that I get from people definitely keeps me going. In fact, I just saw someone today, a friend, I don't know him that well, and he was telling me he was listening to my podcast, and he's like, yeah, I keep thinking about it, Amy, and I'm thinking about launching a business, and he's an attorney, and he's like, yeah, your podcast is giving me all these ideas. I'm like, really? Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm going to keep doing this.
That's sweet.
So yeah, I love getting that feedback, and that helps keep me motivated. But I think as far as barriers, I have had some technical barriers, particularly with some of the software. I mean, you and I've talked about this, but just I was starting out in GarageBand, which is great. I feel like it's really easy to use. And then I'm trying to switch over to Audition, and it's a little bit more complicated.
Yes.
So we might be talking later.
Sounds good.
But I can also see there's so much more capability.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, I need to go this route.
Yeah, and once you figure it out, it tends to be a little easier just in terms of the regular production.
I mean, like anything, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's those first few times trying to wade through the craziness that's always a little difficult.
Yeah.
So what are some of the results you're seeing in terms of audience? Like you said, you're getting a little bit of feedback already from people. Are there any other results that you're really seeing?
Well, as far as statistics go, I don't know what's normal or what's good, but I'm getting, usually like the first week an episode goes out, it's getting like 200 downloads, and then a few weeks later it's going up to about 600 downloads. So, I feel like I have a pretty tiny niche. So I feel pretty good about that. Like, 600 people are listening to this. That's cool.
Yeah, no, that is awesome. Like, I think the average across all podcasts that I keep hearing about, the statistic is like 125. So, like, lifetime of the episode. So
okay,
so
cool.
Like,
that makes you feel good.
You're doing all right. You're doing all right. So
yeah,
that is nice.
Nice. I remember, there have been a few points where just like total downloads, like, oh my God, I got 2,000 or like 5,000, you know, and those moments are really cool.
Yeah, no, well, because I mean, another great way to really think about it is every week, basically, you are getting 600 people in a room and talking to them. Like, we'd all be ecstatic if we got to stand in front of, you know, 600, 1,000 people every week or so. Like, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, so how about in terms of business-wise? Are you seeing anything develop there? What's that kind of looking like for you? Or is the podcast just a great way to kind of build your authority?
So one thing that I'm seeing is I've done some free downloads, you know, developed some things that coincide with certain episodes. You know, I have a 20-page ebook that spans like 3 or 4 episodes, and then, you know, a couple other like 1-page downloads. And so I am seeing some increase with my mailing list. I couldn't tell you the numbers off the top of my head. They're not amazing. I mean, it's a few dozen, you know. So that's been good. The other thing is that just as far as my consulting goes, as I've been talking to people just unrelated to the podcast who know nothing about the podcast, and they're interested in hiring me to do something, and, you know, I say, hey, you know, by the way, you can go to my podcast and you can hear me talk about this, you know, and they're kind of like, oh, really? That's cool. So I think it's a little early to have seen any return yet, but there's definitely some excitement and interest. So time will tell what happens.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, what they're best for is just developing that relationship. So I think, it does sometimes take a long time to really see that return, but then things start coming and you get the wheels moving, and then it really kind of picks up steam, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I haven't specifically used it yet, like, you know, to try to sell something or anything like that. You know, maybe eventually I will. I feel like right now my goal is just to like figure out what I'm doing, you know, and make sure that I get it out every week.
Well, and that's great, and it's also awesome that I think that you've been offering those resources on your podcast, those downloads, just because that starts also getting people used to going back to your website or, you know, opting into things in order to receive that information. All right, so do you have any advice for a brand new podcaster or someone who's just thinking about starting a podcast, maybe where you were in November?
I think one thing is to watch out for the imposter syndrome.
Okay.
Which, do you know the imposter syndrome?
Yes.
Yeah, so the imposter syndrome is where I feel like it's usually more common with people who are experienced and professional in their field, yet they feel like, oh, at any point someone's going to figure out, I don't know what the heck I'm doing. And I definitely found myself getting caught in that. Like, oh, do I know enough about creativity and teams? Like, should I even be doing this? And, you know, and then I kind of realized, no, it's fine. Yeah, there are definitely people who know more, and there's a lot of people I know more than they do, you know, and so it's just how it's always going to be. So I think my advice would be, you don't have to be the absolute expert in order to start the podcast.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a great point about it being people who already are a little more professional. You know, people who already know enough that they don't know everything. Like, they kind of get caught in that middle piece there. Because if you're brand new to it, a lot of times you're just willing to dive right in just because you don't know that you don't know everything. So yeah, I think that was a great little point. So you talk, you know, your podcast is all about being creative, specifically leading innovation with teams. But do you have any suggestions for podcasters out there who might want to create a more creative podcast?
Well, my first suggestion is if you listen to my podcast,
you'll learn all about it.
Actually, I go through this process. I think it's like episode 3, I introduced something called the creative problem solving process. And then episodes 4 through 7, it's like a workshop. We just go through each aspect. So yeah, I think as far as, you know, trying to be more creative, I think some of it is just sitting down and taking the time to be more creative. Because I think sometimes we just are like, oh, I'm not creative. But then if you like look at your day, I'm like, yeah, but you didn't even allow yourself time to think of any ideas or anything. And like it or not, creativity takes time.
Yeah.
And so I think just, you know, sitting down, whether, you know, it's a sketchbook and pen and just, you know, coming up with some ideas, writing some things, or whether it's going for a walk and just intentionally thinking about stuff. But yeah, I think just give yourself time to think of some ideas and talk with other people. But be careful who you talk to, because and we all have those people in our lives that are like wet blankets.
Yes.
And it's like, you could have the best idea on the planet and you tell it to this person like, oh yeah, no, that's stupid. You're not going to do that, are you? It's like, so just pay attention to who you're telling.
Yes.
And kind of hold it close to you if you feel like someone's going to shoot you down. Just, they don't need to know everything you're doing, so.
No, I think that's an excellent point. I think that's a great little piece of advice for those podcasters out there. So do you have any maybe resource or tool that you found to be very effective or that you use on a regular basis that you might want to share with our listeners?
As far as podcasting?
Podcasting or even just the creative process in general.
I do use... I have to think about this one. I guess one tool, going back to what I said a minute ago, the creative problem-solving process.
Okay.
So the process is, you have some challenge that you figure out what your challenge is, and then the second stage is coming up with ideas. And there's all these amazing tools to come up with ideas beyond, the brainstorming. We all know how to brainstorm, right? But there's all these other tools, and so sometimes I will use those tools to, just like, oh, I'm kind of stuck, and just staring into space, brainstorming isn't working. So, like this product I make, Climer cards is one tool, but there's like all these different ways. And so I think that's one resource, is just figuring out, what are some other ways you can come up with ideas. And then, honestly, like when I get stuck, because there's generally, as far as podcasting goes, something technical that, especially with the soundboard and the software and like YouTube. It's like I YouTube every problem,
Great place to start.
Or even lynda.com if you have a subscription to that. So those are great resources. And of course, the power of podcasting.
Nice. Awesome.
But yeah.
So if our listeners want to connect with you, where's the best place for them to find you?
On my website at climerconsulting.com, and it's
Perfect.
CLIMER consulting.com. Yeah, so you can find a link to the podcast. You can contact me that way. So.
Perfect. And yeah, we'll link all that up in the show notes as well for anybody who's wondering where to find you. But I guess last question, do you have any final little words of wisdom that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would say just go for it. I mean, try it out, see what happens. Yeah, if you're thinking about podcasting, the worst thing is you put it out there and no one listens to it. It's like, well, whatever, you learn something from it, If no one listens to it, it can't be that embarrassing because no one heard it.
Exactly.
I don't know. Yeah, I think just go for it. I think that, sometimes we just get so afraid and caught up in ourselves. And so, yeah, go for it. That's my advice.
Awesome. Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It was great to be here.
Hopefully you enjoyed this episode with Amy. If you would, please go to thepowerofpodcasting.tv and you can find all the show notes there, including links to Amy's show as well as the other resources we mentioned. And also, while you're there, please go subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. This helps make sure that it gets delivered to you each and every single week as we're putting out a new episode every week with great people. We have a couple more case studies lined up similar to Amy's. We also have bringing in a few more experts to talk about their area of focus, including next week we're going to be talking to Don Stanley all about content marketing and what it actually takes to create content to put out in the world. So we're going to stay focused on the actual creation of the content for your podcast here in this little couple weeks where we're going to dive into that, including another solo episode coming the week after that where we really focus on how to figure out what sort of content you need to be creating. So tune in next week, and until then, go out there and take action to actually maximize both your impact and your income.